You know, we think of our technology as the absolute peak of human achievement, right? But what if I told you that our most advanced, most terrifying weapon might actually be a rediscovery? Today we're going to dive into this really wild and honestly kind of spooky connection between an ancient superweapon from Hindu scripture and the atomic bomb.
Okay, so picture this. It's July 16th, 1945. You're in the New Mexico desert. The world's very first atomic bomb just detonates. This massive, terrifying mushroom cloud climbing into the sky. And the guy who made it, J. Robert Oppenheimer, what's on his mind? Not physics, not equations, nope. His mind jumps back 5,000 years to an ancient Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, and he recites this exact line.
And that right there, that's the big question we're tackling today. Why that quote? Why an ancient text at the dawn of the nuclear age? Was he just being poetic? You know, trying to sound profound? Or, and this is the really fascinating part, did he see something in that explosion that he recognized? Something he'd read about in a description from millennia ago? To figure this out, we've got to go back. Way back.
Okay, so to get to the bottom of what was really going through Oppenheimer's head, we have to look at the source material. We need to dig into the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata. And in it, there's a description of a weapon called the Brahmastra.
Now, the first thing you have to understand is that the text makes it very clear this wasn't just like a big sword or a fancy arrow. No way. The description is, well, it's cosmic. It talks about a force that harnessed a fundamental power of reality itself. We're talking about a whole different league of weaponry here.
And when you read about what happens when this thing goes off, it is genuinely terrifying. The texts talk about an incandescent column of smoke and flame. They say it was as bright as 10,000 suns. Just imagine that. They called it an iron thunderbolt, a messenger of doom that could supposedly wipe out an entire people. Poof, just reduce them to ashes.
But here's where it gets really, really strange. It's not just about the big boom. The texts go into incredible detail about the aftermath. They talk about survivors whose hair and nails just fall out. Food supplies getting poisoned, even birds turning white. I mean, come on, that's not what happens after a normal fire or a conventional explosion, right? This points to something else entirely.
So you have to ask yourself, is this all just, creative writing? A bit of poetic exaggeration to describe a really big battle? Or were they writing down something they actually saw? Well, things get pretty mind-blowing when you start putting these ancient descriptions side by side with what we now know from 20th century science.
Let's start with that light, bright as 10,000 suns. What does that sound like to you? Because to a scientist, that sounds exactly like the thermal flash of a nuclear detonation. It's the first thing that happens, this incredibly intense, blinding burst of light and heat that comes even before the shockwave hits.
All right, now for the hair and nails falling out. This is a big one. It's not just a vague description of sickness, it's a textbook symptom of what we now call acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. It's literally what happens when you get a massive dose of radiation. It kills off the fast-growing cells in your body, like your hair follicles. So the real question is, how on earth could an ancient writer have possibly known that? How could you just make that up?
And what about the food being infected? Again, this lines up perfectly with a modern concept, radioactive fallout. After a nuclear blast, all this dust and debris gets kicked up, becomes radioactive, and then falls back down to Earth. It gets in the water, in the soil, in the crops. It poisons the entire food chain. It's one of the most insidious, long-lasting effects of a nuclear weapon.
So, the connections aren't just in the words on a page. Some researchers point to what might be actual physical proof. Let's go to the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro in modern-day Pakistan. Archaeologists there found something really eerie. Skeletons just sprawled out in the streets, not buried or anything. It's like whatever happened, it happened so fast that nobody even had time to react.
But here is the kicker. At that same site, they found chunks of vitrified rock. Now, vitrification is just a fancy word for stone that's been melted into glass. To do that, you need an insane amount of heat. We're talking at least 1,500 degrees Celsius. And there are really only two things we know of that can generate that kind of heat on the ground: a massive meteor impact or an atomic blast.
Okay, I know what some of you are thinking. This is pretty wild stuff, right? And you're right to be skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So let's be fair and look at the other side of the coin for a second. What's the main counterargument to all this?
Well, the main argument from skeptics is that this is all just poetry.
that the ancient writers were using really powerful, dramatic language, metaphors and exaggeration to describe a really, really bad battle, something fought with conventional weapons, just described in a very epic way.
But, and this is a big but, that brings us right back to the central mystery. Look, it's one thing to get poetic about a big fire. The flames reached for the heavens, It's a completely different thing to accurately describe the very specific and frankly non-intuitive symptoms of radiation poisoning without ever having seen it.
And that's the real problem for the "it's just poetry" argument, the specificity. Why mention hair and nails falling out? Why talk about poisoned food? These details are medically and scientifically precise, and they just don't align with the effects of any known conventional weapon from the ancient world. It doesn't quite add up.
And that brings us all the way back around, back to that dusty morning in the New Mexico desert, back to Oppenheimer staring at that mushroom cloud, with the gears turning in his head.
So when Oppenheimer spoke those words from the Gita, maybe it wasn't him just being dramatic. Given all these parallels we've just looked at, it seems like he had a moment of pure, chilling recognition. He realized that the awesome destructive power he had just unleashed, it wasn't new. He had recreated something the ancients had not only described, but had explicitly warned against.
Which leaves us with one heck of a question to chew on. Is the story of the Brahmastra just a myth? A really cool story? Or is it a memory? A faint echo of a technological past that we've completely forgotten? And if it is a memory, then it's not just a story. It's a warning. A warning that's just as relevant today as it might have been thousands of years ago. That's something to think about.